Hi, welcome to Bashani Radio and iHeartRadio Worldwide. This is Entrepreneur Empowered. I'm your host, Attorney Sid Pedinti. I welcome you to today's show. Today, I want to talk about your business, and specifically, I want to dive into how you, the business owner, the entrepreneur, the captain of your ship, can predict and mitigate losses in your business ahead of time. In particular, I want to dive into the concepts that regulate the internal mechanisms, the internal risks, the internal conflicts that exist in your business, as well as perhaps the mechanisms that can help you predict and mitigate external, so things that are outside your organization, the risks that exist and impact your bottom line from the outside, and how you, as the business owner, can gain the upper hand in every transaction that you enter into during the course of your business by understanding, first of all, where threats, where different risks, and where different conflicts can exist, and understanding the different mechanisms, understanding the different rules, understanding the different legal strategies that you can equip yourself with in order to mitigate these risks ahead of time. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you're tuned in online, if you're watching this presentation, what I have here today in front of you is a brief screen with three circles on it. And each of these circles will represent a different viewpoint in your business. So if you have the opportunity to pull up a sheet of paper or pull up a computer pad and take some notes, feel free to do that. Let me just briefly talk about why this topic is important, as well as give you a brief description of who I am if you're tuned in for the first time. My name is Attorney Sid Pedinti. I am the founder and CEO of California Law Services, which is a boutique business and intellectual property law firm located in Manhattan Beach, a suburb of Los Angeles. We are on the famous Pacific Coast Highway, just a mile from the beach. Beautiful neighborhood. But let me tell you that, uh, you know, things did not happen overnight. It seems fancy. I have a very nice law firm, but it took a long time to get here, right? And now that we're here, a lot of the businesses that end up in my office are technology firms. They are entrepreneurs and business owners from different diverse backgrounds who have assets, who have ideas, who have existing contracts. These are busy individuals who have a lot going on in their businesses, and chances are there's a lot of different conflicts that exist that they may not know about as well. Now, prior to having my law firm here and focusing on business and intellectual property, I actually operated a bankruptcy law firm for over 10 years. Actually, it's 12 years, 2006. This is in Canada, in Toronto, where I'm originally from. And during my bankruptcy practice, which I silently manage now, the majority of the entrepreneurs and businesses that ended up in my office did so because of one of three reasons. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and show you some of these right here as we talk about it. Like I said, if you have a sheet of paper, feel free to draw three circles that intersect with each other in the middle. One can be on the left, one can be on the right, and one can be slightly below them in the center, underneath them. Okay? So the first one we're talking about is conflicts and risks as they exist internally inside the business. This was one of the areas that impacted virtually every business owner that ended up in my bankruptcy firm, right? I'm talking about risks that exist in the business model itself. You might be in an industry where there may be high regulation, there may be more governmental oversight, there may be a different regulatory body that's investigating you or keeping a close eye on you. So, this may impact the way you can conduct your business, the way you market yourself, the way you reach out to your potential clients and even strategic partners, right? So, you want to pay close attention to the way you're setting up your business, the way you're managing your business, and many of the business owners who did not understand the intricate complexities that were involved in managing a service based business where they offered professional services, generally in price points that exceeded $1,000 per transaction. Right? If it's more than $1,000, that's considered a high ticket item. And when you're offering a high ticket item, there's a lot of risk that come with it. This is hard earned money that somebody's giving to you as part of a transaction in the expectation of certain services or even a product being delivered. When you have a product, if your business is a product based, you know, the rules and regulations are slightly different. There's strict product codes and regulations that impact the transactions or the purpose that you're designing the product for, what is called fit for purpose, and other regulations regarding the exchange process. Now, when you're delivering services, which dives into the mind, right? It's information that you possess, it's knowledge that you possess that you have transformed into a service, into a program, into a course, into something that could be part of a transaction that people are paying you for, then the mechanism is different. Then we're talking about something that is not truly ascertainable. These are intangible products in a way, right? Services are intangible products. And so pay close attention to your business model. Make sure you check the different regulatory compliance related issues as well as any insurance if you need insurance. You might even have specific needs that you may have to employ an attorney for or an accountant for. So make sure that you set up your business in a way that is compliant from the scratch, right? From the inception phase itself. The other second thing that you probably want to pay attention to, and this is again speaking about internal conflicts and risks as they exist within the organization. Another area that led many smart, savvy business owners into my bankruptcy offices were the way they structured internal contracts. So here we're talking about contracts with your founders, so co-founders or partners. We're talking about contracts with employees. We're talking about contracts with other contractors, independent contractors. We're talking about contracts with interns that you may hire. We're talking about contracts with strategic advisors, right, who are helping you set up your business. So these are all different areas where internally, right, if somebody is who you can consider having confidential proprietary information about your firm, working on the inside, helping you organize, helping you manage your business, then in a way these are people who have direct control, right? They may not be the manager, but in a way they impact your your ability to manage your firm successfully. So this is an area you want to pay close attention to. We'll dive into the specific terms of what you need in a contract, what you need to look at in agreements a little later in the show. But for the present purposes, let's just stay with the high level and focus on the possible conflicts that you may encounter broadly when you deal with these parties. and the areas that you need to pay close attention to and focus on protecting, focus on predicting risks, focus on mitigating potential losses in these areas. When we talk about partners and co-founders, um, let's dive to the other screen for a second. Whoops. When you talk about partners and co-founders, you're talking about uh, quite a few different areas where possible conflicts may exist. Number one could be about the management, right? So let me go ahead and draw that up here. So we have the areas, we have management of the organization of the firm. We have we can have a conflict in the way the firm is structured, the firm is modeled, where there's confusion or disagreement between the partners, or board, even if a board exists, on the mechanisms that should be deployed, the legal structure that should be adopted, perhaps even the business model that should be integrated as part of the new company, right? Or as part of a company that's growing. There might be one partner who thinks a partnership model is better, where you should be general partners, where another partner considers an LLC to be the more appropriate legal structure for your business. There may even be a situation where one of the board members is hesitant to move forward unless you file an incorporation, more specifically a C corp, right? C corp, where it's taxed as an entity. So these are questions and areas that can cause confusion, that can cause conflict, that can impact the way the company is managed, not only in the short term but in the long term as well. One of the other things that exist, or arise rather, in as a result of these situations is the liabilities, is tax liabilities, is penalties, is different, perhaps even sanctions based on the way you behave, right? Or even conversion fees. So let's say you start off as an LLC and you want to incorporate the company and move into a different legal structure. Now, that conversion may have a tax implication. It may have that in the federal level, it may have that on a state level. So, this is something you want to dive into ahead of time, that you want to be able to negotiate among yourselves, among the parties, openly before you go ahead and file the documents. It's part of the negotiation process. It's one that you need probably some professional help with. These topics are extremely technical. They can have, like I said, short term and long term impact. And so, one of the things you want to do is make sure that you're in compliance throughout the entire process. Pardon me for a second here as I just adjust my mic. All right, so let's talk about. So we talked about founders, we talked about partners. Let's talk about employees and the possible risks that exist as you work with employees. Once again, it can be in the managerial style, right? It can be a difference of prior experience, prior training that may make a difference. It may be a personality clash that may make it tough to work with certain employees. It may be a different mindset or missions that you believe in. Uh, if it's a company with a specific mission, let's say you are based on, without diving into any specific examples, people believe in different objectives. So let's say the employee is one that does not believe in the core mission of the company, but it pays well. Now, they may not be as motivated to work to their best, or they may be areas they may not pay attention to. So these are potential things that exist, as well as intellectual property when you deal with employees. If you're in a business that, let's say, is a closed or a tight market, where things are kept internally, where there's not too much competition, where there's high value, for example, or high risk transactions that exist, then there's information that has a lot of value. There's information that could be perhaps kept as a secret. These are different areas that you need to consider having as you draft your employee agreements. You want to ensure that intellectual property that the employees, or in this case, even contractors, even interns in specific cases, may have access to, the way they use it, the way those things are reflected in contracts, the possible risk and limitations of those. Now, think about where an employee would leave your employment and having gained specific understanding, certain insights, go to your direct competitor, right? It, for those of you thinking, hey, is that fair to stop somebody from doing that? Well, yes and no, right? It's not a clear answer. It depends on the situation, depends on the motives, it depends on the actual behavior. So in these sort of situations, there's a term that the courts use that you probably want to consider as well, and that's called the totality of the circumstance, right? When you look at the circumstance or the situation as a whole, do you possibly see a pattern of behavior? Do you see any possible conflicts? Do you see a specific pattern, a mode of operation under which the particular employee in question may have acted, right? If they went and spilled your trade secrets over to a competitor. So, and how do you act against that? How do you predict that? How do you mitigate that ahead of time? That's again where contracts come in, that's where agreements come in, that's where an understanding of what sort of terms and disclaimers and limitations, non competition clauses, and other such terms and conditions really kick in. You, as a business owner, and especially if you have employees or contractors or even interns, these are things you need to not only consider but understand. Okay, um, let's move on to some of the external risks that may exist in your organization. Okay, so before I do that, just a recap of the internal, what we've talked about so far. And if you're taking notes, if you're drawing out these tables, or if you're just listing some of these that exist in your firm, once again, when we talk about risks and possible reasons why companies go bankrupt, and the way to avoid that ahead of time, ahead of the situation, is to be able to predict some of the risks and address the different terms and conditions that can help you mitigate the losses by making poor decisions, okay, when it comes to these areas. So when we talk about internal risk, I'm talking about the inherent business model itself. I'm talking about the restrictions. I'm talking about regulatory. I'm talking about compliance. I'm talking about insurance. I'm also talking about legal and financial impacts that are going to impact your bottom line, right? So so that's one side, the business model. The second side, internally, where you want to focus your attention on, is when it comes to contracts and agreements. And when you talk about contracts and agreements, we're talking about contracts in different areas with different parties that have different purposes, right? That protect different things, that mitigate losses that can occur in different ways, and they can equip you with the tools and strategies ahead of time so that you have alternatives for these situations as they occur. So, in terms of contracts, I talked about contracts with founders, talked about contracts with partners that you may work with, and some of the things that you can discuss or where conflicts exist, which exist in management, it exists in the structure, in the vision, in the direction. It may even exist in the type of legal or financial or business model that you may choose to deploy and work in for your company. It may even have consequences where the founders who don't have enough information or make poor choices have financial consequences later on, and possibly even government related fines and sanctions if things are not done properly. We talked about also employees, contractors, and even interns, and having contracts that talk about intellectual property protection, talk about non compete clauses, non disclosure. It's also important to have and pay close attention to proprietary information, to confidential information, to the dissemination of information as it occurs in real time, right? Also, possibly against defamation, where you have a disgruntled employee or a contractor or an intern perhaps, and they leave your employment to go and talk about or what they talk about and cannot talk about, right? Maybe you want to have those things clearly stipulated in these contracts. That way, there's no confusion later on. Look at all the news that's going on right now in the world and the things that are being, um, whistleblowers who come out, as well as internally who come out in different ways, and the information that's being spread, things that perhaps could even be considered insider information, right? That can have a big impact on your bottom line. So think about these conflicts. Think about the possible remedies that you can have and the alternatives, the diversionary mechanisms that you can adopt a specific situation into so that you can reduce the risk. Let's talk about, so with that recap, let's talk about the external conflicts, risks, and losses that can occur in your company, in your business, and perhaps even in your finances. This doesn't necessarily have to be just in a business context. So from an external standpoint, we have three large parties where poor decisions, poorly drafted contracts, or even losses that occurred in these areas caused individuals to end up in my bankruptcy office once again. Okay, so from an external point of view, we have clients and customers, we have vendors, suppliers, and manufacturers. And then we have marketers, growth experts, technologists, etc. Okay, so let's dive into that with a bit more detail. And I'm going to draw out here three circles again that will dive into each of these specific areas. So the first one I said is clients and customers. The second one is suppliers, manufacturers, and the third is marketers, strategists. Let's call them marketers, okay, or growth related help. And I have that in here specifically because that's an area that almost every business now employs somebody to do the marketing for them, as well as paying a lot of money for it, right? $500,000, $2,500. I've even employed marketers close to $5,000 a month. So these are areas that have a lot of high value. They involve transactions that involve thousands of dollars, and it's something that can impact your bottom line if you don't understand your rights, if you don't understand how to protect yourself, if you don't understand how to divert yourself or divert the risks or mitigate the risks into different avenues, right? Where you're not losing money. Let's talk about your clients for a second. Customers. Now, as you've heard, obviously the customer is everything, right? Customers, it's all about sales, it's all about marketing, and you're right in that aspect. A big chunk of it is. But at the same time, if you're having customers that are not going to enhance your bottom line, give you problems, then of course there's going to be a lot of confusion. There could be a lot of lawsuits, and this is an area based on in as well as in my personal experience that can bankrupt you, right? Um, if you don't understand it. So, from clients and customers, what are some of the problems that can come up? Number one is the expectations. So, we're talking about what you're offering versus what they understand you to be offering. We're also talking about the dollar value. Almost always it comes down to a monetary number. So, is it more? Is it less? Are they giving you your dollar's worth? So, we're talking about value. We're also talking about scope here. And we're talking about, lastly, just the relationship among parties. Okay, so those are the different areas that can impact your bottom line from the outside, from a client perspective. When you talk about expectations, from the get-go, you want to have very clear expectations on what you are willing to do and what you're not willing to do in the course of your engagement, right? Many times, business owners, and I see this happening quite a lot, many times business owners end up taking contracts or taking cases or taking on customers because of desperation, because of lack of revenue, because they don't have enough clients to begin with, right? Or they don't have a consistent flood of clients being generated every month, that they're forced to take on areas, number one, areas that they are not comfortable with. So that may be something outside your realm of expertise. They may be forced to take on projects or work with cases that they normally wouldn't because they don't get along with, the personality doesn't get along or something else with that client. So in that case, you're thinking to yourself as you take on this client, oh boy, I wish I didn't have this client. Or you don't look forward to that meeting, right? That's the situation. We've all been there. In the early stages, yes, it's very tough to do or to progress or even to stay afloat without taking on those cases. But as you get busier, there is no reason for you to develop a portfolio of clients that you enjoy working with. The other type of expectations, where in terms of expectation, what can go wrong, is where the scope, I know I have scope up there, but here the scope is not clearly defined. Where again, it's a desperate project, you're taking on the case because of a number of reasons, and none of them have to do with what you'd like to do, right? Your area of expertise, your area of comfort. So once again, there's expectations in terms of the scope. They might not be clearly defined, and that can cause problems as well. So once again, make that very clear, craft that into the agreements that you have. Make sure you to talk about that in length in every single engagement that you enter into. Lastly, make sure that you have a clearly defined written contract. Okay? Be professional about the engagements that you enter into. No matter which party is with, make sure you go ahead and write things down, right? Have a clear track record of it. If you need to print it and sign it, make sure you do that. If you need to email it to yourself, that way there's a written copy of negotiations and talks or recaps, go ahead and do that, right? That way things are clear. And as you develop your contracts, as you develop the things that are happening, uh, both parties are going to be on the same page regarding what's expected out of this job, how much it's going to cost, and perhaps even a timeline. And these are the things you want to have in a checklist that you develop. That way, things are clear and you're building a book of business that is well defined. Let's dive into the second one. We're talking dollars and value, right? So, the price of a product where conflict may arise. There's a few different areas where client problems may arise when it comes to the dollar value. This can be in the beginning itself, it can be during the course of the engagement, or it can be after, right? In the first situation where you have certain clients um, that are ready to take the deal, but unfortunately the deal doesn't go through because of a difference in price, right? Perceived price. So let's say you start the work, you're starting to get things underway, and now because of expectations that you built on the earlier one, the price that's being projected is slightly different, right? This can be from right from the get-go, right? So let's say you're taking on cases, or you took on a client, you're doing some work, you put in sweat equity, and you haven't got paid yet, but from the beginning, you have been tracking your time, you have been understanding um, and you figured out the dollar worth, but at the same time, payment has not come in. So there can be a difference from the get go. The second one is during the situation, right? You're taking on work, you're doing the work, and now halfway through the project, there's a different price based on the value. The last situation is after the work is done, right? And these are the cases that you see on TV all the time, where a work has been performed, a work is being performed, and a project stopped halfway through. It could be about price, it could be on service, it could be the speed at which a particular job is done or not done. Right? So these are the things you want to consider when you're talking about price. When you have the scope, earlier I talked about having a scope. This is important to have in contracts. It's important to have in your message. It's also important to have this verbally. And then lastly, what you want to do is have a recap of the scope over and over again so that you can clearly define expectations and at the same time you can clearly figure out the value of the price and have the mechanisms uh, that dictate what a client can expect from you in that. Okay, so that's where scope comes in. So if you have, for example, a $20,000 product and you know that's going to be a disputed product, maybe the scope can be in three phases, where the first phase can be 10 grand and the next two phases in three, two and three. This way, instead of relying on one payment of 20,000, where if the person doesn't pay it at the end of the job, you're stuck, you can spread the risk on your end in different ways, right? And have the scope related to those specific things slightly different. So just that small strategic move or legal maneuver in the way or when you price a product can make a difference in the way you close accounts receivable, right? The way you're guaranteeing to get paid at the same time mitigating the losses that that can occur from this transaction. This way, instead of blowing the 20,000 as just said, you can get perhaps 10. And then as the work is performed, again 5 and 5, right? Enabling you to recover as you perform. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of client related questions or problems or risks is based on personality. Here it's based on the relationship. So once again, it goes into these three aspects of it. You want to have clear expectations. You want to make sure it's professional, so do charge value for it, and have the scope clearly defined so that the relationship is going to be smooth. It's going to be focused on getting things done. It's going to be focused on value rather than spending time on price points, rather than spending time on things that are not going to enhance both your bottom lines. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense in terms of how you can predict some of the risks that exist with clients and what you can do, small shifts that help you and enable you to emerge as the winner in these transactions, right? By mitigating some of these losses, by predicting ahead of time the areas of possible conflict and having the mechanisms to mitigate those losses. Again, once again, here in suppliers, okay, which is the next big area externally that can cause problems. Suppliers, it can be a cutoff in supply, it can be the quality of the good, it can be the quantity of the good or service that's being provided, it can be once again a personality difference, or it can come down to pricing or something else, possibly a defect. Who pays for the defected goods? Who pays for services that are not being performed? Um, Talk about cutting off production, right? If your supplier pulled the plug on you, would your business stop? Do you have alternatives in place to pick your business back up immediately? These are the questions you want to ask yourself. When I talk about a supplier, again, keep in mind this could be a manufacturer, it could be an exporter, it could be a wholesaler, or it could even be someone who is helping you fulfill. Uh, Give me 1 second, I gotta go and get my battery, my charger, so my computer doesn't die. And I'll let you think about this for a second. Think about the possible and write down the possible risks that I just mentioned from suppliers. And what will you do if your supplier cuts you off? Alright, sorry about that. So, from a supplier, a manufacturer, exporter, or even wholesaler, or maybe even outsourcer, somebody you outsource some of your internal goods or service manufacturing or fulfillment to. What would you do if your supplier or manufacturer decided to pull the plug on you? How do you maneuver yourself, right? And so think about quality in expectations of quality, have that be clearly defined, have alternatives in place so that if one avenue closes, you have others in place so that the disruption doesn't happen in your company. In terms of quality, make sure there's strict compliance measures in place and standards, things that you can check against, right? Quality assurance. Also have mechanisms in place and the terms that define the quantity to be expected, the fulfillment of that, and measures uh, that when it doesn't happen, when there's no fulfillment, what could happen. All right, so quantity. Um, let's also talk about the expectation of price points with suppliers. So if you are selling a good product and you're outsourcing a portion of it to somebody else, then you're looking for a mechanism in there where the price point should be lower, right? You want to make sure that you have the mechanisms in place that you can predict ahead of time what the pricing is and price yourself accordingly so that you can predict ahead of time possible fluctuations, adjust to inflation, figure out the profit margins on your end. And again, once again, having a diversification of suppliers of different goods and products can enable you to have the competitive edge when it comes to this pricing, right? Having more options on your table allows you to be more competitive, right? That's your bargaining chip. So don't forget to focus on those things as you think about your suppliers, as you think about manufacturers, or even exporters, wholesalers, or others who you outsource your goods or products or delivery to. When you talk about marketers, which is the third chunk of the external risks and conflicts that exist in your business, I'm talking broadly about, and here I think we can dive to a new screen once again. I'm talking broadly about the individuals who help you grow your business. So you can have marketers as one, you can have strategic growth partners as one, and you could possibly even have investors. Actually, investors would be the internal. So we have marketers, suppliers, we have consultants, coaches. So from a marketer perspective, what are the things that can go wrong? Hey, number one, it's they're too expensive. Pricing changes. Number two, they are not delivering what they promised. Number three, there's a conflict in the quality of the work that's being done, or the particular strategy that's being deployed, or perhaps just the results. They're just not working as expected. From a marketing perspective, you can also have just a poorly defined scope with the marketers so that there's no synergy or synchrony in the way that things are being done. Things are not congruent, right? Where the focus is on one trend, where the whole market is adopting a different trend and moving in a different direction, right? So this again comes down to strategy. So it may be a core difference in the strategy, but because of your scope, it limits you. It limits your marketers' ability to do or not do certain things. Okay, and then the last one, of course, is just the quality of the work, right? Is not defined in the scope, and so it's kind of broad-ended where you're not satisfied. So these are the problems with marketers. Also, think about intellectual property. This is something most business owners forget. Intellectual property is being transacted in many parties and many hands as a marketer is involved in your company. They find out about the way you work internally, your strategy, your finances, the mechanisms that are working, that are not working, and whatnot. So this is information, again, that's considered a trade secret, and you as a business owner have the responsibility to ensure the marketers that you're working with. The same thing applies to the strategists or even the consultants and the coaches. Of course, they're helping you grow your business, but at the end of the day, it's your business, right? It's your intellectual property. And so you want to stay focused on that and have the terms that limit use of the intellectual property, that restrict the ability to work with direct competitors using your information, which is what happens. The ownership of the intellectual property and the assets, the data that's being collected, the names on the customer list, the emails that have been deployed. These are all things that you as a business owner should have total control and retention of, and not being confused with somebody else. So those are the strategies I want you to consider, and I want you to incorporate in all the different agreements and contracts that you have in place, right? So that the marketers, the strategists, the coaches that you're working with are not going to jeopardize the things they're helping you build as soon as the relationship, if it does, turn sour, right? Once again, I have seen this plenty of times, and the business owners that have been affected a lot by this have ended up in my bankruptcy offices. So don't make the same mistakes. Make sure you predict these things ahead of time and act the right way, right? Lastly, we have one more for today, and I will give you all the details that you need. If you need the templates, these templates, by the way, just reach out to me at the end of the show and I'll be more than happy to share them with you. So we talked about internal risks. We talked about external risks that exist in your business. And what I want to do today for the remainder of the show is just go through a quick checklist that you need to know and you need to have, or you need to understand, that go into contracts that you enter into. Okay? So we're talking about the internal operating agreement. We're talking about the way you operate internally, the different terms that go into managing the different rights and regulation and interaction of the members among themselves and with outside parties. One of the things you want to pay close attention to in the articles of organization as you put it together is the capitalization. Who invests what in the company? Okay, and so here we're talking again more specifically about the parties that are internal. So we're talking about founders, co-founders, investors, or others who work internally with capital. So pay close attention to the capitalization of the company and keep clear track of who is investing what. Now, if you're a solo person running a business, it's still important for you to understand how much time, resources, and money you are investing into your business. Every dollar, every hour has value, right? You could be doing something else. So ensure that you take those as capital allocation. If you've been investing hundreds of hours building this company, that's certainly sweat equity. The other thing you want to focus on next is the shares in your company, especially if you're an incorporation, if you're a C Corp, S Corp, or even an LLC. You want to make sure you understand who gets what share. And that has to be according to value, not 50-50 just because it seems like the right thing to do. You want to also pay close attention to the dividends, if any, right? The way each member gets compensated. That's part of the capitalization. The overall rights and regulations if the company was to either be sold or go liquidated, right? what portion of those debts, what portion of that liability would belong to each partner. The thing you also want to pay attention to in contracts is the allocation of income and the distribution of income among parties, right? Which party invested how much and how do you distribute that? What about records? Who has a right to inspect which record? How do you allocate this internally? How do you differentiate who gets to select what to do? Right? Who makes the managerial decisions in terms of the allocation? Is it one party? Is it two? What are the remedies in case there's a deadlock or there's a conflict? What about in the event of liquidation? What happens to the revenue that goes into the company? Who does it get allocated towards? Right? And how's that split being done? What about voting rights on particular decisions, direction, company objectives? So think about allocation in terms of that and how revenue will be allocated based on those different factors, based on the voting, based on how people can get to say or dictate what happens to the revenue. One of the other things we want to pay close attention to as well is management, operations of the company, right? Is there one big partner or is it two? How are meetings to be held? Right? These are things we want to think about. What about dissolution? So make sure you have some clauses based on if the company dissolves, what happens to the assets. What about indemnification, where a party acts on behalf of the company or maybe on their own accord, and there's some sort of loss that happens or occurs because of that person's action? Are they liable to pay the company back because it's on the company's name? Will the company be liable to pay for their mistakes if they're outside the scope of the company, or if they don't belong to the company but they're working on the scope of the company? Right, so that's an area that you want to think about, especially where third parties and contractors are involved as well. You want to also pay attention to the wind-up procedures, clearly diving into the procedures that get triggered and the clauses that get triggered when a wind-up, dissolution, or even a bankruptcy may occur. Pay close attention to investment representation and the power of attorney. Who has the authority to sign on behalf of the company, and how do you restrict that? Okay, so these are some of the terms in a nutshell that you want to think about. Non-competition clauses, management, allocation of funds, distribution of profits, capitalization, indemnification, amendments, voting rights, right? Managerial rights, miscellaneous provisions. What about lawsuits? What about proceeds from sale? Also, we're talking about the majority versus three-fourth, right? Two-thirds or three-fourth representation. So these are all the different clauses, these are all the contracts, these are the different terms that you want to think about, that you want to incorporate in different agreements internally and externally. And that's, in a nutshell, how you predict risks, how you predict conflicts, how you predict things that may impact your bottom line ahead of time, and have the mechanisms, have the tools that help you predict them ahead of time. I hope this episode of Entrepreneur Empowered Show has given you a new perspective on your business, has triggered something that will help you think about the losses that can occur from the different topics and strategies we discussed, specifically internally and externally, and how they impact your bottom line and what are some of the clauses, what are some of the techniques, the legal strategies that you can deploy and actively integrate into your firm, so that way these losses are mitigated, the potential conflicts are minimized, and you will emerge as the winner in every transaction, internally and externally. Once again, I thank you for joining us. My number is 213-924-3466. My company website, once again, is California Law Services. You can find us on Facebook. If you have any questions relating to the topics we discussed, feel free to reach out to me with your question directly. I'll be more than happy to help you. That's it for today's show. I'll catch you next week on Entrepreneur Empowered Network, and I'm going to have with me on next week an amazing guest who specializes in technology, business, entrepreneurship, and finance, and we're going to hear from her on how she has been breaking barriers, has combined the strategy that we've been talking about for almost the past month and a half to in her businesses, and we'll wait to hear from her. But that's it for today's show. Once again, it's Entrepreneur Empowered, and I'm your host, Attorney Sid Pedinti, aka the Entrepreneur's Attorney. I will catch you here next week. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.